Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 2021 legislation pertaining to boards and commissions, CLE. Many of these trainings, or all of them, will contain a good amount of overview of their area of law, including updates from the 2021 legislative session to those areas of law. If you have questions, if you put them into the Q&A function in Teams, it's the little conversation bubbles with a question mark at the top, and we will, when presenters are ready for questions, we'll bring those in and get those answered. The same is true with the chat. If you have issues, we'll be monitoring those. And let me introduce Jeffrey Minicucci, a senior JAG with the Boards and Open Government Division, to give you training on state contracting.
Thank you, Rosalie. Can you hear me and see the screen? Am I coming through at all?
Yes, Jeff, you're coming through. We can see your screen and we can see your videos, so you're good to go.
Very good. Thank you. As Rosalie mentioned, I'm a senior deputy attorney general. One of my clients is purchasing division, so I encounter lots of contracts. And today we're going to be going very quickly through some basic contract laws and practices. I understand we might need a keyword if you want to get continuing education credit. And the keyword on my section is bids. It's down at the bottom of the screen. Bravo, India, Delta, Sierra for those who like their phonetic alphabet. All right, let's get started. One of the first things we're going to be looking at is the sources of procurement law in the state of Nevada. And that's primarily in Nevada Revised Statutes, chapters 333, 333A, and 334, as well as the Nevada Administrative Code for those chapters. Also, there are provisions in the State Administrative Manual in the third section of that that govern contracting policies and procedures. Now, the main types of contracts that you will probably encounter are, first, services of an independent contractor, and this could be a number of things, from the guy who fixes your air conditioning to your accountant to your people who move your office equipment. You may also have contracts for purchases of goods. Occasionally, we have installment purchases or lease purchase agreements that are provided for under statute. And there can be contracts between governmental entities, both within the state of Nevada and government entities from other states or the federal government. You may encounter leases. Sometimes the state is the lessor and state lands generally handles those. Sometimes the state needs to lease property or office space from other entities. You may have a revenue contract. These are not common, but occasionally the state is compensated for services or facilities that it provides to others. Some miscellaneous contracts, there may be volunteer agreements. There may be licenses to use state facilities. And there's always the issue of grants. And a grant is actually a contract if we are awarding money and expecting that there would be any enforceable duties of performance. There is a chapter in the State Administrative Manual governing procedures on federal grants. And if you're going to use the federal money, you have to dance to the federal tune. So you pretty much are kind of bound by the federal procedures on that. And why is this important? Well, it is state policy to secure the best value for the taxpayer in all goods and services. And also knowing the process and the potential issues can expedite your procurements and your contracts. And there is personal responsibility. I cite a couple statutes here, NRS 333-810. Contracts contrary to Chapter 333 are void, and there is personal responsibility on the person who tried to enter such contracts. And NRS 353-260 has a provision that it's unlawful to bind or attempt to bind the state and for any amount in excess of the amount provided by law or in any other manner than provided by law. One of the main contracts you'll have is a contract for the services of independent contractor. The state has contract forms for this, and they can be found at the link provided. The standard form contract, and there's also a short form contract, which would apply to contracts under $100,000, used to be $50,000. The short form may not be appropriate even if it is a small dollar contract, if there are a lot of attachments that you need, or if it's a special kind of contract or requires special kinds of insurance. But those forms can be found on the purchasing website. Why is it important? Well, it's important to use the standard forms if you can, because they contain a non-appropriation clause. And one of the things that we cannot do is we cannot commit to pay money in excess of that which we have available to the state or its agencies. There will be limits on the state's liability in accordance with our statutes and the state's sovereign immunity. We will get an indemnification from the contractor in the standard form, but the state does not contractually indemnify the contractor. There are provisions for insurance. There are warranties that we would expect to receive from the contractor. And the contract is going to be subject to Nevada law and Nevada jurisdiction. Those two items that I starred on the previous slide were recently affected by legislation. Senate Bill 445 has a provision that says that a contractor may not require us to litigate or arbitrate in another state or nation, and may not require the state to indemnify another party against liability for damages. And that was passed in the last session and became effective on the 1st of this month. In all contracts, there should be an insurance provision, and that is determined by the state risk manager. The standard form contract will use a separate insurance schedule. And those schedules or examples of such schedules can be found at the risk management website. They have a contracting manual, but it may be a good idea to always check in with risk management, because depending upon the nature of your contract and the services to be provided, they may have some specific recommendations. The short form contract has some insurance requirements embedded. There are 4 potential ones in the contract: workers' comp, comprehensive general liability, automobile policy, and professional liability. If those are all not required, they can be taken out. But usually you'll have at least workers' comp and comprehensive general liability. Some other issues that you might encounter is if you're trying to contract with someone who is a current or former state employee. One of the things to be aware of is, for a couple of sessions now, there's been a statutory requirement that the contractor cannot boycott Israel. And that's also in our statutes, chapter 333. And the contractor has to agree to that or certify that they do not do that. One of the things you need to be aware of is, if you're dealing with a contractor, the contractor is probably going to want you to agree to his terms. Contractor may submit its own form. And if the contractor does, you can pretty much bet the farm that it will contain provisions detrimental to the state and may even violate state law. Some of the main issues are state sovereign immunity and the damage limitations applicable to the state of Nevada and its agencies. The contract may expect indemnification from the state. It may not be aligned with our state laws on confidentiality and availability of public records. There may be unconditional obligations, acceleration of payments, and penalties in the contract. They'll probably want any disputes to be decided under the law and jurisdiction of another state. And the contractor, as you might expect, would like it if we agreed that they have either no liability or limited liability if they mess up. I'm not exaggerating that I have seen contracts where the contractor wants the state to say that they won't be liable for any indirect, consequential, or punitive damages, no matter whether it's a result of breach of contract, negligence, or even intentional tort. And their total liability will be limited to just a portion of what we've already paid them under the contract. That's usually not a good idea. It might not be completely illegal, but usually not a good idea to agree to that kind of thing. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is under Chapter 333, contracts for services and contracts for goods are processed differently. Services, you have a contract for services of independent contractor, and it generally requires approval from the Attorney General as to form. That's under NRS 333-700. Goods are generally procured by the purchasing department on an invitation to bid. A bid comes in, and if the bidder is selected, there's a notice of award, and that becomes the contract. And the role of the purchasing division is basically to get involved in the big contracts, and purchasing may authorize agency purchase of goods directly or agency direct contracting for services. If you're dealing with a contract for services, the criterion for awarding the contract is what is in the best interest of the state. And that is usually determined by the scores that are assigned to the proposals. If goods are being solicited, the criterion is who is the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. The main contract authority in statute is contained in NRS 333-700. It allows and grants authority to contract with independent contractors. Some agencies, like the Department of Transportation, have some independent statutory contract authority and may not always have to go under Chapter 333. This statute applies to using agencies, which are defined in 333-020. They are officers, departments, institutions, boards, commissions, or other agencies in the executive department which have any support from public money, and that could be from either state, federal, or private, or other sources. And then there are some statutory exceptions, such as higher education, housing division, and local governments. Most contracts that are going to be entered into under NRS 333-700 are going to require some form of Board of Examiners approval. There's an exemption for contracts less than 2,000. For contracts between 2,000 and less than 100,000, the clerk of the Board of Examiners would be able to authorize and sign off on that. And that was recently enlarged from the 50,000 level by action of the Board of Examiners last month. And if it's $100,000 or over, then the Board of Examiners, as a full board, needs to approve the contract. But there are exemptions. There are exemptions from BOE approvals. And you can find those in subsection 8 of NRS 333-700. One of them, and this is kind of goes back to the old IBM Selectric typewriter days when office equipment maintenance and repair were exempted. And the state administrative manual used to have a provision exempting contracts from BOE approval if they were for computer software maintenance license agreements, remote download of updates, and offsite technical support. That provision was removed from the state administrative manual in September when the Board of Examiners met. Now, competitive solicitation is normally required for contracts. That's the paradigm. Some of the authority on that is in the administrative code. If you're going to be spending more than $25,000 in any fiscal year, then you're going to have to operate and obtain the contract by a request for proposals. That if it's for purchasing, then they're going to be doing it, especially if it's over $100,000, although the agency may occasionally do their own, even on large contracts. If it's less than $25,000, informal solicitation, and hopefully you get at least 3 proposals, may be acceptable. One of the policies in the state administrative manual is that we resolicit every 4 years as a general rule. Goods, of course, are different. Large purchases of goods will be by a formal invitation to bid. Purchasing division will handle those. Local purchasing can be authorized. Now, there are, of course, exemptions or exceptions from the necessity of competitive solicitation. In the Nevada Administrative Code, 333.150 contains those. One of the main ones is if it's a sole source and you can only get it from this particular vendor, it doesn't make any sense to go out and try to compete it. Another class of exemptions is for professional services, and another is for emergencies. And emergency contracts, as you might guess, have been used a lot during the pandemic, panic, or emergency. And the thing to remember here is in the administrative code, the necessity to go by an emergency contract is determined by the chief of purchasing. Now, the professional services exception is interesting because it lists 5 specific types of professional services. And if you fall within one of those categories, you don't have to do a competitive solicitation. If you have another type of professional and you think you don't need to compete competitively on the contract solicitation, that is a determination that has to be made by the chief of purchasing. So if you fall within one of the listed categories, you can proceed, such as an accountant. If you're dealing with a contract for your accounting, that can be done without competitive bids. But if you have someone else that you think might qualify as a professional, but isn't listed, then contact purchasing, and they will usually require some kind of a solicitation waiver request. Some special cases: installment purchase and lease purchase contracts do not have to follow the competitive solicitation rules of Chapter 333, but that section doesn't apply to everybody. Some boards are exempt from 353. But it does apply to the state of Nevada or state agencies, and the lease purchase or installment purchase can be used both for real property and personal property. If it's real property, Chapter 353 has some specific procedures that you have to follow. They don't have a lot of procedures for personal property. Some other special cases: if you're leasing equipment, the administrator of purchasing has authority to lease. And if you have agreements between government agencies, there are a couple of things in Chapter 277. One are the interlocal cooperation agreements. More relevant to us here are the interlocal contracts between public agencies. And these, by the way, do require Board of Examiners approval under the state administrative manual. You may have a need to lease office space. Probably need to contact Public Works ahead of time on that, even though some boards are exempt from the provisions for leasing. Insurance, I mentioned this before. The state risk manager is the one who has the responsibility for procuring insurance for the state and also using means to reduce risks to the state. And one of the things that we usually do is we require that a contractor have insurance. And the risk manager is the one who decides what insurance is necessary. They have an insurance manual, as I mentioned before, and here's the link for that. And it contains the types of insurance and recommended limits of insurance concerning different types of contracts. But that is not as easy as it sounds, because a contract may be for a small amount and entail a significant amount of risk. So the amount of the contract doesn't necessarily determine the amount of insurance. Another thing to watch out for here is if the contractor's liability is going to be limited within the contract, it could make high insurance limits meaningless, because insurance company isn't going to pay for things that the contractor isn't liable to pay. And again, the common types of insurance: comprehensive general liability, most businesses have that; automobile liability, if they're going to be using vehicles anywhere near the state or your agency; workers' comp is usually required, although a sole proprietor may reject by executing an affidavit of rejection; professional liability in appropriate cases; sometimes commercial crime or fidelity bonds are required. If they're going to be messing with our information technology systems, we may require network security or privacy liability. And one of the issues that we constantly have to worry about is disclosure of personal information that could make us or the contractor liable. So now you've got your contract, but you need to amend it. And fortunately, there is a form for that as well. And you can find that on the state purchasing website. The form is sort of a hybrid. In one place, it gives you a spot to state the reason for the amendment and what you're doing. And in the second section, it's a cut and paste where you put, here's the language of the contract now, and here's the language that it will be after this amendment. So if you do both, make sure they match up. Both sections say the same thing. One of the things to be aware of and caution is that you don't want to extend the term of the contract too long by successive amendments. As I mentioned, the state policy is generally every 4 years we want to go back out for solicitation to make sure we're still getting the best deal. The other thing is to increase the amount of the contract, the NTE, or not to exceed amount. I've seen contracts that started out just for a few $1,000s and ended up over $1 million, and it doesn't look good. There may be justifications for it, but that's something to watch out for. You probably should not be trying to do an amendment if you solicited the contract for one service and now want to add something different. That should be a new contract. Occasionally, the contractor will change its form. It may go from a corporation to a limited liability company. That may require both an assignment and consent to assignment as well as an amendment. If it's a company that has shares and someone buys shares in the company, that doesn't change the form. So it's still the same entity. But if there's a new entity, you may need to do an assignment of the contract. Now, do you actually need a new contract? One shortcut is to look at the purchasing website and maybe call purchasing and see if they have a good of the state or master agreement that can be used by state agencies. And if they do, that's already been solicited. It's already a contract in place. And all you have to do is basically do a purchase order against that contract. Some other shortcuts in statute are allowed. And the vendor may have a contract with either GSA or some other government agency for the same supplies and materials. Or there may be a contract that was solicited by another government, either within or without the state of Nevada. And we may be able to use that solicitation as a basis for a Nevada contract. Contact state purchasing if there's a question on that. One of the things that purchasing division provides are training courses, and each agency really is expected to have a contract manager and to take the certified contract manager course. And here's a link to the purchasing website. That course will cover procurement, contract management, and one of the really important things is use of the state's contract entry tracking system, SETS for short. Because sometimes that's one of the most difficult things is to figure out how to use the software and the system that we have. But that's a good course, and you can sign up for that. And one of the experienced purchasing officers normally presents that course every few months. So that's really what I have for you today. Again, the key word for my section is bids, and you may need that to get continuing education credit. So with this, I'm hopeful that the next session that we'll entertain will be Legislative Council Bureau's audit provisions and audit requirements.